You're listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.
Welcome to the Mammal Watching podcast with me, John Hall in New York.
And me, Charles Foley in Minneapolis. Well, John, we have just come back from West Papua. A quite fantastic trip, wasn't it?
It was the adventure of a lifetime. Yeah. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm actually still getting over jet lag, and It's been a week since I've been back. It's a long way away from anywhere, but I have just been absolutely buzzing from the simply incredible mammals that we saw on the trip. So 2 species of tree kangaroo and the western long-beaked echidna.
Yes. What an animal.
Right.
Yeah, that was absolutely one of my all-time highlights of my life. And it was incredible, wasn't it? We saw it was over 60 species, and I think it looks like maybe 1 or 2 might be new for science, or will be one day when someone goes and collects them. Some big range extensions on others. I think in terms of new species, for me, it was the most successful trip I've ever done in my life. I've got 50 new species from Papua alone. It's just crazy. And as Carlos kept saying, we weren't having terrible views. We had good views of just about everything and had pictures as well of all these things. So it was extraordinary mammal watching, and what an adventure.
Yeah, indeed. And we will discuss it. We will have a dedicated podcast to this as our next podcast. And we will go into all of the details then. But just to say, it was astounding that we could go to a place like West Papua, where everyone had said that it was going to be incredibly difficult to find the wildlife, and yet we had such an amazing trip.
Wasn't it? Yeah. Now I just need the jet lag to heal, my insect bites and infections to heal, and it'll all be rosy.
Absolutely. Well, I am extremely happy to introduce our guest today, who is Luke Hunter. Now, Luke has worked in conservation for the past 30 years and is extremely well known in the conservation world for his efforts to protect wild carnivores. Luke was a founding member and former director of Panthera, and now he is the executive director of the Big Cats program at WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society. And I imagine many of our guests will be familiar with Luke's name from his books, of which he has written 8, including The Carnivores of the World, The Wildcats of the World, and he is currently in the process of writing the Princeton Encyclopedia of the Cat Family, which I am sure will adorn many of our bookshelves soon. Luke, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Charles and John. Great to be with you.
Great to see you and meet you finally. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely, a pleasure.
So, Luke, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be a carnivore specialist?
Surely, yeah. I'm Australian originally, born and bred, and I grew up in Australia, which is not known for its carnivores. We have very few there, very few placental carnivores, at least. The the dingo, of course, which is the only terrestrial carnivore, and that's a recent import. Came with people some sort of 3,500 to 5,000 years ago, I guess, depending upon who you believe or which estimates you believe. And the seals and sea lions, but otherwise no placental carnivores, of course, other than introduced species. But so I grew up there. I became fascinated with carnivores, especially cats, from a very young age, and that was just a fortunate turn of fate. The story apparently is that I was in hospital when I was 3, just recovering from having my tonsils out. I had tonsillitis, and tonsils came out when I was 3. And one of the gifts that I got and still remember was a bag of plastic animals from my grandmother. My get well gift from my gran was this bag of pretty crappy plastic animals, but I fell in love with them. And in fact, still have the lion and the tiger. They're at my folks' place in Melbourne, Australia. And so that was it. It was kind of just baked in from there. I was really lucky, I think, that the spark had begun through this fortuitous gift. And then I think my folks were great at fostering it when I was a little kid. They were both teachers, both retired now, but they were both teachers. They were both great researchers. My dad in particular, he worked in the Australian government in the public education system, but sort of resourcing school libraries. And so he's really good at finding books. And so from a very young age, this is before the internet, before bookfinder.com and, all the tools we have today, he would track down all these obscure and terrific books on carnivores and especially cats. And by the time I was sort of young teens, he was finding really good, pretty scholarly stuff. George Charles' A Serengeti Lion, which that was published when I think I was about 4, and he would find me a great copy of that, and I'd get it as a birthday gift or so on. So yeah, they were just great at fostering this interest, and it sort of didn't wane. It just stayed in place. I think I was really fortunate. The sort of decision about a career was taken away from me because I just had this mad obsession. There wasn't any real planning or really sort of strategy about it. I just was really, really fascinated with carnivores and especially cats, and from this young age. So I went to finally when I studied science, was really interested in science as a school kid, as a secondary school kid in Melbourne, and went to Monash University where I did zoology, BSc in zoology and honours there. The Aussie system is like the British and South African system. You do a sort of an honours year and need to do that to qualify for graduate studies. And then in 1992, with my honours degree in hand, I went to South Africa, and that's where I was really lucky to begin my first work on carnivores, which was actually on big cats. So that's how I ended up in this field.
Fantastic. And as someone also who had a toy zoo, which I'm still trying to find, it's somewhere in my ex-wife's house at the moment, I understand exactly the power of those plastic animals. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
and
go.
I have to admit, they make some incredibly realistic looking toy animals now, these little plastic ones. I think it's a German make, and every time we go to a zoo we buy some of them. I think I've got a giant pangolin and a giant anteater sitting somewhere on my desk, so great little things.
Terrific.
So you currently work as the director of the Big Cats program for WCS. Can you tell us some of the projects that you're focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, a very hallowed, storied, old organization. I think it's in its 127th year now. It was created as a New York Zoological Society originally, and WCS runs manages and runs the 4 New York City zoos and the Brooklyn Aquarium, but then also has a very large global conservation program in about, I think it's now just on 60 countries around the world. And in half of those, a focus has always been, very large, charismatic, conservation-worthy big species like big cats. And I think WCS has done a really, really good job. For example, on the tiger, some of the sites where WCS has been embedded for a long time, very focused on helping the government with protection and preventing of poaching and illegal hunting and persecution of the tiger. We're seeing real successes. We're now seeing the tiger actually recover in some of these sites in places like Thailand. Of course, India, I think, is probably very well known in terms of its recovery success. But so the organization WCS has had a sort of a long history of working on some of the cat species. And then this is actually my second stint of WCS. I did 5 years back in the day, Charles, when you and I were colleagues there, and
right,
and then left for a while to create another organization called Panthera, which focuses only on big cats. I came back about 3.5 years ago, and since then my focus, I've been really, really interested in focusing on recovery of lion in WCS sites, the lion in Africa, and especially in Central Africa and West Africa, where the species is really sort of endangered, critically endangered, officially, or endangered. And WCS had actually mostly not focused on the lion as a species. I think, part of it was the perception is, the lion does so well in fairly well-run, very large protected areas like Serengeti, like Kruger in South Africa. They reach high densities in those sorts of areas where, again, they're fairly well protected. They're really visible, so people have the impression that lions are doing great. It's a kind of Animal Planet syndrome. I mean, you turn on Animal Planet or Discovery Channel, and there'll be an awesome documentary about lions filmed at one of these places. But that's mostly not the case for lions across most of Africa, and again, especially in Western Central Africa. And so, starting from about 2019, I've really been focused on how WCS helps to really accelerate the recovery of lions in the landscapes where WCS again has a presence and has a sort of strong relationship with government and local communities to really be effective. And so that's really, you know, I'd say that's sort of 50% of my job now is really focusing on the recovery of the lion. And so that's taken me to some really interesting landscapes in countries like Cameroon and Central African Republic and these places which you know, are for the intrepid wildlife watcher and also have been neglected, I think, a fair degree in terms of really sort of big concerted conservation attention. They're difficult countries to work in. They've had, you know, in some cases, you know, long civil wars or civil strife, or, you know, continue to have insecurity and other challenges that make it really difficult for you know, tourists as well as for conservationists. And WCS fortunately has targeted a number of these countries and big protected areas within these countries with this real recovery objective. And so the small part that I play in that is really how we focus on the lion, how we design interventions that will really be effective in preventing the decline and actually recovering the lion, you know, changing the trajectory of lion populations in these places. And also monitoring them, because they can be quite a difficult species to monitor in places where they've been persecuted and they're shy and they're not tourist friendly. They're not the places you can drive around and expect to see them. And monitoring them, I think, is really important because, you know, we want to be able to show and test the idea that the interventions, the activities that we are designing and cooperating with typically with range state governments with the objective of recovering lions and other wildlife in these systems, we have to know whether they're working. And so being able to monitor populations, test this assumption or this hope that they will recover if we do the right things, that's also really important. It's been a big part of my focus for the last few years.
And what would be the main areas for lions in West Africa at the moment?
So in West Africa, there's only 3 or 4 populations, and that's the largest is the WAP complex, you know, Parc Duglavie in Benin and the surrounding areas in Mali and Niger. And that population, I'm actually not sure, it's probably slightly more than 200 adults there, adult lions. Then there's Niokoro-Kobra in Senegal, which is a very small population but recovering, and that's probably about sort of 30 animals, maybe 3 dozen animals there. And then in Nigeria, there's 2 very, very small and really sort of beleaguered populations. And WCS is actually active in one of those. But then beyond, so that's just West Africa, and I'm sort of carving up the regions here, with the technical definitions. Central Africa lions are doing a little better, you know, but they're still, again, considered endangered. And so, that West and Central African, they're regarded as separate clades because they're genetically somewhat distinct. But of course, they're the same species. Their lions are the same species in South Africa and Tanzania. But the line across that entire West and Central African region is a separate subspecies to the East and Southern African animal. So they're now classified as the northern lion, the subspecies from basically Senegal across to Northeast Africa, and also in Asia, the gyr lions, the last remaining Asiatic population. This is the northern subspecies. And then everything essentially sort of, east and south of the rift, from Tanzania more or less down to South Africa and Namibia is now called the southern lion. So where WCS and my particular interest is really focused on that northern subspecies, which again is really far more imperiled than the southern one.
Right. So let's take it back a little bit to your PhD and postdoc work, because you did some really interesting work figuring out how to reestablish populations of both lions and cheetahs in areas where they had gone extinct in South Africa. Can you expound a little bit on that work?
Yeah, be happy to. It was really, a fantastic opportunity for me. So I went as a very green, 23-year-old Aussie kid to South Africa to work at the Mammal Research Institute, which I'm sure many of your listeners know. It's still current, very, very active research institute at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And I started my PhD there looking at how to reintroduce large cats into systems, into areas where they'd been extirpated from, where they formerly occurred. And the opportunity arose. It was a really interesting period in South Africa's history. It was just as the sort of last gasps of apartheid were happening. So 1992, Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, where he'd been for decades. The white Afrikaner government at the time, the president was F.W. de Klerk, had embarked on this process of it wasn't called reconciliation, but of reform. And among the things they did at the very end of 1991 was to have a referendum, a national referendum, which asked the voting public, should we continue on this process of reform? Should we, open up? It was essentially asking what South Africans thought, in terms of reform and apartheid. And but of course, at the time, only white South Africans voted. They were asking the white minority South Africans, what do you think of these reforms? I mean, incredible to think of now. But fortunately, white South Africans, had an overwhelming yes vote to that question, i.e. the reform should continue. And so there was just a very rapid escalation, which really culminated in 1994 in the first democratic elections in the country. And of course, Nelson Mandela became the president. Now, ANC has been in government ever since. But that whole opening up of the country really enabled a massive surge of interest in terms of, all sorts of business and investment, but especially in tourism. And so, whereas formerly, South Africa had, correctly been a pariah and you didn't go there, if you were interested in wildlife safaris. Some people could, but there were boycotts and sanctions, and you really morally, I feel, should not have been going there, and many people made that right choice. After 1992, and especially accelerating through 1994, that just all opened up, and so there was this incredible surge in interest in tourism. It was focused on wildlife, and it drove the recovery of these systems where wildlife had been extirpated, or at least big charismatic species like elephants and rhinos and the mega ungulates, and of course the large carnivores had been wiped out. And so I arrived just as the wave was building, where both the public sector, the national parks and state reserves, and also the private sector were really interested in how to take advantage of the interest, and essentially how to reclaim these formerly wild areas, but which were significantly transformed, and of course had lost a lot of the major species, particularly the big cats. And it was just it's a fantastic opportunity, because I started as a sort of a very young graduate student on this project, which became my PhD at a private reserve in KwaZulu-Natal called Phinda, and which is still going, a terrific place to see cheetahs as well as many other things, but which has a privately owned reserve, had aggregated a number of sort of very small, what we call game farms, privately owned game farms, which again had mostly extirpated the big mammals, except for there were leopards and spotted hyenas at very low densities, but intensely persecuted. But Phinda, or at least its mother company, a wildlife ecotourism company, was very interested in, of course, having this full suite of originally indigenous species there, and that whole process culminated in reintroducing lions and cheetahs. And so these were wild caught lions and cheetahs in other parts of Southern Africa from very robust populations, like from around Kruger Park, translocated into this new destination, this new release site. And essentially my job, and what became my PhD and my sort of research questions, was to figure out how to foster success. Could it work? What were the important technical aspects of doing this that would improve the likelihood that it was going to restore a population? And so it was absolutely absorbing and fantastic opportunity for me, but also became the sort of the early model for what now there are over 50 restored populations in South Africa of large cats, which have sort of followed the same process, and some of the findings of that first effort, and which was my PhD study. So it was tremendous, a tremendous amount of fun.
So, as many people know, the Indian government is in the process of bringing cheetahs back to India. What's your take on that? Do you think it's going to work?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. I'm not sure. I think it's a really interesting one. There's been an enormous amount of debate, significant amount of opposition within the country from very experienced Indian conservationists whose opinion I defer to, and they question the wisdom of it, given there's a big debate about them being African versus Asiatic cheetahs. Firstly, which of course the Indian cheetah would have been the Asiatic subspecies, which is quite distinct from all the African subspecies, and there's a little bit of debate about the number of African subspecies, but not about the distinctiveness of the Asiatic. Of course, they're just, the only Asiatic cheetahs are left in Iran, and they're a very, critically endangered, depleted population, and just not, a source for the introduction. So anyway, there are African cheetahs there, and that debate continues. But in terms of the likelihood of success, so there's, again, the stuff I was talking about in my PhD, has just blossomed. So there's an enormous amount of technical expertise, particularly in South Africa, but it's more broadly in Africa now on successfully translocating, again, wild-caught individuals, not captive-born individuals. I think there's a big difference there in terms of success, and you just shouldn't use captive-born individuals. But wild-caught, cheetahs who know how to be cheetahs can be translocated quite successfully. And again, South Africa is really sort of the world leader in this stuff. I think the challenges in India are really interesting. Cheetahs are starting to die, which with that reintroduction, which is to be expected. Cheetahs are starting to leave the protected area, the national park, Kuno, which again is to be expected. It's not very big. I think it's less than 800 square kilometers. And then, of course, in India, they're surrounded by a sea of humanity and transformed landscapes and so on. So I think there's a great deal of concern about what happens when the cheetahs leave, and when they're not sticking to the protected area. Of course, it's not fenced. As incidentally, many of the reserves, you'll know this, but many of the reserves in South Africa are the smaller reserves, and by that I mean everything under 1,000 square kilometers. All the privately owned reserves that were the sites of these reintroductions in the 90s and 2000s, and have mostly stopped now, but they're all fenced. They're all strongly fenced, and tend to not completely exclude cats like cheetahs leaving, but of course they keep them in to a large degree. Not the case in India or most of the rest of the world, of course. And so right now there's a sort of a real debate, I think, about the likelihood of it working. I think it can work. I think the really interesting about the thing in the project's favor is, firstly, India's, you guys will both know, and many of the listeners will know, is just an amazing country in terms of its tolerance for living with large, dangerous animals. Right. They live with tigers and elephants and sloth bears and Asiatic lion and all that. And there's an amazing amount of tolerance. It's not, of course, not perfect, and it's not, absolutely without its issues, but a very high degree of tolerance compared with how much of the rest of the world responds to living up close with large carnivores. And cheetahs are, relatively, compared to certainly most other big cats, they're relatively innocuous. They don't kill people. There is not a single record that I'm aware of a wild cheetah killing a person. And so what they do, of course, when they create some heartache, is they kill livestock, particularly small stock. And then that's inevitably going to happen here. I think the challenges there, and maybe this is where I don't know well enough, but it seems to me the real preparation in that project should absolutely have focused on the interaction and involvement and education of local communities, knowing that cheetahs were going to encounter them. And I imagine some of that has been done, but I don't know to what degree. But I think it could be quite successful if local people were really on board with that. Local people really understood the cheetahs weren't a threat to human life. And again, there are species in that landscape which people do tolerate, at least to a degree. Leopards being a great example. And so really sort of not I think worrying so much as is what is happening now about cheetahs leaving the reserve, and the authorities are racing around, recatching those cheetahs and popping them back into the national park and into enclosures in the national park, which I think that's probably just the wrong way to go. And what needs to happen is a significant number of cheetahs need to be sort of released at once. You need to get a critical mass, assuming that there's going to be some mortality, especially in the first sort of year 2 or 3. And then also, again, doing as much as you can to foster tolerance in a place which is already amazingly tolerant, to allow cheetahs to occupy modified landscapes. And as we know, Charles knows this really well from Tanzania, cheetahs can do a pretty good job of that, where people don't tolerate species like lions because they're so difficult to live with, and they really are, just a sort of an order of magnitude more dangerous and more damaging. Cheetahs, on the other hand, can be lived with by many human communities where they exist in Africa. And so I think, I hope it succeeds. I mean, don't disagree with some of the criticisms about how the focus should be on tigers and all the rest of it. But at the same time, it's kind of exciting to have cheetahs back in a country where they're extirpated in the 50s. Again, even if they are African cheetahs, I think it could succeed with with the right focus.
Yeah, well, it certainly seems to have captured the public's imagination over there. That's for sure. But just going back to your PhD, what was the smallest area that you found could successfully sustain a sustainable population of cheetah? Because the Indian park, you said, is 800 square kilometers.
It's a little, I think it's 740 something, 750 something. But yeah, and so it's a postage stamp. But there are. I mean, Kuno is, I will say, when the assessment was done, I think the projected area that was deemed suitable for cheetah occupation was about 3,000 square kilometers, because there is patchwork of forest, savanna, more highly modified agricultural areas, which was, and that's probably the case, so long as there's, natural prey. Inevitably there'll be livestock and dogs and so on in that system. But, the cheetahs, again, could occupy a larger landscape and wouldn't need to be restricted to 750 square kilometers. But Charles, to your question, well, there were actually small areas. I mean, Phinda, when I started, it's larger now because Skradget consolidated with other surrounding landowners, both public and private. But it was only 250 square kilometers. But again, it was fenced, and so it's still fenced. It's just now it's a larger landscape. And in fact, initially in the early days, cheetahs, and this was true of lions, but Phinda was very thoughtful in that they reintroduced cheetahs before restoring lions, anticipating that lions would have some impact on cheetah numbers, because of course lions do kill cheetahs, and especially the cubs. We actually found that happens much less in these savanna woodland ecosystems than it does on the Serengeti shortgrass plains, just because cheetah mums are really good at hiding their cubs and they don't encounter them, and when they do, they're much better at getting away. I mean, when a lion can see a very, very young cheetah from a long way away on what is essentially a golf course in the Serengeti, there's just nowhere for the cubs to go. But that's not the case in these savanna woodlands. So the cheetah numbers grew very quickly. And in fact, in the early days, even before I'd finished my PhD, Phinda had begun a process of needing to capture and start translocating cheetahs born into the reserve into some other new reserves. And so there was this whole, chain of reserves which was springing up and restoring big cats. So there was a demand for it, but also part of the need from Phinda's point of view was there were just too many cheetahs too quickly. And they can breed prolific. They're a prolific animal when they have all the right conditions. They're not. There's all this sort of mythology, I think, about them being so genetically depauperate, which is the case. But they don't have inbreeding depression. They do not suffer from reproductive limitations. So long as sufficient cubs survive, and that's the ecological limitation when you have a lot of lions and spotted hyenas in the system. But if they have lots of prey and they're successful at raising cubs, cheetah populations can recover really quickly. And so, but again, I think the fencing in the South African model was probably a key issue to begin with to sort of get that critical mass. I would love to see fences come down and fences removed in a lot of these places. That's really limited prospect, I think, in South Africa, where there's just not going to be tolerance for not so much the cheetahs, but really dangerous species that cause a lot of damage, like elephants and lions.
Yeah. And in India, what is the main prey in Kuno for the cheetah?
There's quite a lot of prey apparently. It's cheetah, spotted deer, nilgai's there, and they will. I'm sure they will take baby nilgai, the blue bull. I can't quite remember the figures. There is a comprehensive assessment, before they did the introduction, and so and there are high densities of cheetah. So I think prey. It's very unlikely, I think, that prey would be a limiting factor. The other big factor, I think, which maybe I haven't read much about, and I wonder how much it's been considered, but just domestic dogs, feral or free-ranging dogs in the system. And there are tons of those, and that will be a real issue for cheetahs, because cheetahs, I mean, I've seen cheetahs kill a dog actually once, but mostly, dogs, and particularly the packs that you see in rural India, are a massive issue for wildlife. And even if they're not an impact on adult cheetahs, they will usurp kills from adult cheetahs, and of course they will kill cubs. And so I do worry a lot about just the density of domestic dogs in the whole Kuno system.
Yeah.
So Luke, I know you worked for several years on a project monitoring Asiatic cheetahs in Iran, that tiny population that remains, until the project was sort of abruptly terminated by the Iranian government under very sad circumstances. Can you tell us a bit about that project?
Yeah, surely. Yeah, well, it is a tragic story in so many ways. But yeah, I first went to Iran with the Wildlife Conservation Society in 2005, and at that time, the Iranian government, the Ministry of Department of Environment in particular, had initiated a really committed and comprehensive plan to recover the Asiatic cheetah. And sort of, at the time, there were just guesses about how many animals, but in the dozens. There was always this estimate floating around at the time of fewer than 100 individuals. I think that was an overestimate, but there were some tens of individuals, all restricted to the central plateau of Iran. Quite amazing habitat. Like nothing else where cheetahs exist, except perhaps sort of in Niger and I haven't seen cheetah habitat in there, but perhaps some of these places in the Sahara where there's open habitat with the massifs, with the mountains or the refugia that are really important to cheetahs. That's what the habitat looks like in Iran. And so the Iranian government had initiated this big commitment to conserving the Asiatic cheetah. They were, I think, justifiably, hugely proud that they were the only country which had retained the species in Asia. It was a tiny and critically endangered population, but there were vast protected areas with good populations of prey. There was a reasonable number of breeding females. Even then, that had sort of been established. But WCS got invited in essentially as a technical advisor to assist the Iranian government, and especially in monitoring techniques, because at the time, Iran was, still the case, I say at the time, but very, very isolated just from sort of international scientific collaboration. To have been under sanctions, at least from the US and many European nations since the Iranian Revolution, and so there just wasn't the sort of the access to a lot of the sort of the standard methods, including camera trapping, to monitor species. And so in those early days when I first started traveling there, the main interaction and the main sort of collaboration was really about exchange of these techniques, these robust scientific techniques to count and estimate cheetah numbers. The numbers of other carnivores in the system, which is, it's a fascinating area because cheetahs co-occur with Persian leopards, with grey wolves, with Eurasian lynx. It's just a really interesting mix of species there. And then also monitoring of the prey species, which is also really interesting because they, there we sort of, I came to the realization, but it was because of already good monitoring in place from Iranian biologists. Cheetahs are living mainly on urial, on the wild sheep species, and on Persian ibex, rather than the gazelle species, which the gazelles had been really, really hammered post-revolution because they were just easy to hunt. They were easy to, chase in a four-wheel driver on motorbikes and to hunt, after the revolution, and the protection of some of these protected areas really waned. Whereas the urial and the, it's related to the mouflon, similar, very, very similar species, and the Persian ibex were, they had refuges in the mountains, and so and interestingly enough, the cheetahs figured out how to exploit that, and seem to be doing okay. But so it was I think a constructive and sort of really useful collaboration for a while. And I sort of went, a number of times, I can't remember now, 9 or 10 times, essentially again, just to sort of support that training and largely monitoring. We caught and collared the only Asiatic cheetahs to be GPS collared, and some Persian leopards as well. That sort of occurred in the late 2000s, to get the first sort of telemetry data on their movements in this system, and particularly crossing roads, because roadkill is a real issue for the species there. But then, very, very sadly, the project, essentially, at least came to a close with very, very prominent and useful Iranian conservationists who belonged to an organization called the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation, when they were accused of using camera traps, which many of us, the international collaborators, had provided. It helped, again, with all the relevant permissions and authorizations, ironically, from the Iranian government as well as the US government. But they were accused of using these camera traps for spying on some sensitive military installations in Iran. which of course is just a ridiculous accusation. Camera traps are good for, a few meters in front of the camera there. You get more from Google Earth than you could possibly get from camera traps in terms of, military installations in the Iranian desert. But nonetheless, despite, just the sort of the bogusness of the claim and the complete lack of evidence, 8 of these very terrific, wonderful, very, very committed, smart Iranian conservationists were jailed in 2018, and they're still in jail. Actually, one's been released, but the rest of them are still in jail. And in fact, another fellow, the executive director of this foundation, this Iranian foundation, died in prison. He was jailed as part of the sort of initial purge, and he didn't come out. And there's sort of fears that he was tortured and did not die a natural death in the prison. So it's really quite tragic. Not only from that very obvious personal perspective, but the folks who sort of have languished in jail ever since are, they were really, just wonderful people. Most of them I knew personally, not all of them, but and very, very committed and super smart and just good at their jobs. They were sort of really, a great hope for recovering the cheetah population. And so the interest in the cheetahs has not completely vanished because of this terrible unfolding. But unfortunately, the status of the cheetahs has declined over the same period, and so now there's very, very few cats left, and it unfortunately looks really, really unlikely that recovery is even possible anymore.
Yeah, it's just a terrible story all around, really, isn't it? And to think that, what was it, back in the 1960s, the talk was to actually reintroduce cheetahs into India from Iran. And back then, it did have the population to be able to support it, but that has all gone up in smoke. Yeah, what a terrible story.
Yeah, it is. It's tragic in so many ways.
Yeah. So, Luke, you're obviously spent your life thinking and studying and writing books about carnivores, but would you call yourself a carnivore watcher? By which I mean, would you go out and look for specific carnivores, maybe that you haven't seen, for a list, for example?
John, I am one. I'm sure I'm nowhere near your league. I'm a pretty bad one. I like watching carnivores. I do look for them, but again, I don't think with anything like the dedication that you and, again, I imagine a number of the listeners, certainly a number of the folks I see on mammalwatching.com who just really, really work hard at it. Yeah. I see animals sort of a lot and love seeing animals in the course of my work, which is mostly about conservation and going to places and sort of designing a project or helping design a project, and spending time in the bush in these marvelous wild places. But I do like, when if it's just not in the course of doing that work, I'll go out at night just with a spotlight walking at camp just to make sure, I might pick up a little carnivore. And I don't keep a list, but I do have a modest objective that every time I go to a new place where there might be a new carnivore, I try to find it. I try to look for it. I'm not very good at that. I still don't have much of a cat list, but it works. And so, yeah, I love encountering them. And I also like, so Sophie, my wife, who isn't in the wildlife business, she's a nurse, but she absolutely adores wildlife and wild places. And so we always go to a national park for holidays. That's what we do. Yeah. And so, Yellowstone is a favorite. It was the first place I saw wolves and grizzly bears, and I think have seen every time we've gone there. And so just going and being a tourist, and again, not a particularly good one in terms of sort of compiling a list, but I really love sitting in place and waiting for stuff, whether it's a big vista like in Yellowstone and being able to sit on a hillside with a scope or glass and just waiting for something to happen, or water holes in the African dry season. I'm really happy doing that and just seeing what comes along. And so often it's it's not a new species to me, but it's just a great encounter because you see some behavior or see some interaction or something a little bit unexpected. So I'm absolutely a mammal watcher. I'm not an awesome one, John, to be honest about it.
You're very honest, but you are definitely a mammal watcher. Is there anything that you maybe have looked for or you haven't looked for that you'd love to see in the wild?
African golden cat. Yeah, I've looked for them.
Right.
Yeah, haven't seen them. I mean, I see them, but the greatest hope is sort of coming from mammalwatching.com, where I see now there's a handful of places now where people are just starting to put in the work, aren't they? And I think it's really interesting that just the sort of the proof of concept now, and especially when it comes to cats, I would not have believed that it was possible to get reliable snow leopard sightings. And now, of course, Hemis and Ladakh, and more broadly, Mongolia, even now starting Kazakhstan, it's starting to get. I mean, Ladakh, in the winter, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? And similarly with the Iberian lynx, similarly with pumas in Taurus alpini, and I would not have predicted that for certain species, and actually when I think about that, I realize even there my own ignorance, because I think, well, why not? Where we've always enjoyed it in African game parks and national parks with certain species, and so what are the conditions there? And I think it's obviously pretty good local knowledge, a certain level of protection that means that cats learn that humans aren't terrible everywhere. And then just I think a lot of hard work and really and persistence and particularly I think where people have been able to home in on one or two, with really, really great understanding, home in on one or two resident females, when you can get to those females, and they learn that people gradually over time are not a threat and are innocuous. And this is a key, I think, to Hemis and the snow leopard viewing in Ladakh in Chile with the pumas, to a degree with jaguars now in the Pantanal. That process, if you can gradually get a couple of females used to you, and then of course they're relaxed with their cubs, and their cubs are getting those cues and learning. And so, and it turns out again, still, to my surprise, but I'm just showing my ignorance here, how it seems like, there's not a cat species, maybe not a carnivore species, where in principle that wouldn't be possible. And so where you get, these really dedicated, typically local guides, I think, do all the hard work, figure it out, and then people like me turn up and benefit from that. So I'm hoping they produce the African golden cat pretty soon, because I have looked, but yeah, I haven't succeeded yet.
It's funny because the podcast, the last episode, which came out yesterday, is exactly about this. It's about someone in Uganda, a Ugandan woman who has figured out how to see golden cats with the help of a grandfather's friend who's an ex-poacher. And she was saying they've got some camera traps and they put them in the forest at what they thought were likely spots. Nothing. She talked to this guy Kaheru, the old poacher guy. He goes, "You're going to put the camera traps here and here." And 3 days later, they had golden cat on one of them, and they've now 50% of the time she takes a trip, they see them. So it's exactly
they see them.
It's amazing.
They see. That's fantastic.
They've been taking cat people to see them.
I think I will know her name. I will recognize her name because I know she's been featured. But so I need to make a note. Yeah, I'm going.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how low, sort of down to the food chain, so to speak, this goes, because obviously the big cats create a huge amount of attention. Lions and tigers, and now of course the snow leopards, which, as you say, 30 years ago we had no idea where to find them, and now you can see them reliably, and there will be 200 people standing in Hemis National Park in the middle of winter up in the Himalayas to try and find this thing. It brings a huge amount of money into the economy. So how low do you think it'll go? Do you think that people will be doing this for, I don't know, little black-footed cats or sand cats, etc.?
Why not? Yeah, some people are. I think they're they're mostly followers of your website, John. But yeah, so maybe it's a small community still. But yeah, as there's organized trips to see sandcat in North Africa now. I really love to see these examples where I think tourism is. You just mentioned it, Charles, which is really helping boost the local economy. And we've all experienced those sort of they're a little bit sort of mythological stories, but the poacher turned gamekeeper, the local person who hunted and is now benefiting from tourism. But I've seen real examples of that, and lots of them maybe are stories and they're good for a headline. But there are really good examples of that where cats, especially big cats, have been an absolute fundamental change. And the jaguars in the Pantanal along the Cuyaba, along the rivers there, is just that's a fantastic example where it was all cattle ranching. Still cattle ranching is present, but cattle ranchers and the people who work for them have figured out the jaguars can generate revenue. So they now, instead of being a liability, they're now an asset. And it's absolutely transformed the economy there and the land use. And, and I think even the most reluctant ranchers now look at that and say, okay, I'm not going to get rid of my cattle, but I am going to build a little unit or two to be able to host tourists and start benefiting from this. And that just continues to expand. And of course, then, what inevitably happens when that works, as it is there and in many other cases, many other sites, then, the sons and the daughters of that rancher are thinking, well, this is what we're going to focus on. Cattle ranching's mercurial. It's hard work. It's difficult to make a living. Let's invest more and more in this. And so, of course, you see a transformation. So hopefully, that continues. I think, as countries get wealthier, more and more invest money in tourism and going to places. I mentioned Yellowstone. A huge constituency for Yellowstone now are tourists from China. Going to Yellowstone of all places, huge. And so, in fact, I mean, not just because of Chinese visitation, but Yellowstone is really just struggling with numbers now because of the incredible, not just local but international growth. And China is a massive factor in that because, of course, there's this high disposable income. The Chinese, just like the rest of us, have thought it's really nice going to big wild places and maybe we see some interesting critters. And so, as that wealth and the demand that comes with it grows, I think the opportunity for wildlife tourism, mammal tourism, and especially, of course, my interest, cat tourism, that it only has the potential to grow.
Yeah, very exciting. Do you have any favorite mammal encounters over the years?
John, I struggle with this question because so many. And again, I won't say anything massively rare, but I mean, the most recent favorite, I'll tell you about the most recent, which is not particularly noteworthy, but it is to me because I hadn't seen these species. I was in Bamingui National Park in Central African Republic. WCS has a agreement there with the government to help manage a massive area. That includes 2 national parks, a number of game reserves, a number of old hunting concessions. It's 113,000 square kilometers, which the WCS local staff there, the Central Africans, were very proud to tell me a number of times. I heard that's 4 times the size of Belgium. It's 4 times the size of Belgium. So anyway, I don't know why Belgium is the unit, but in any case, it's 4 times the size of Belgium, and it is huge. It is massive. It's wild. I mean, from the air, it is just largely untransformed woodland savanna. It's magnificent. It's incredibly insecure and troubled in terms of various armed groups being active in that system for many years. CAR has not been stable in terms of having a sort of a stable government now for over 20 years, and so there's what are called rebels, the Seleka, who are in the system. There's armed bandits. There's actually the Wagner Group, which we know from Ukraine, but which the CAR government has contracted to bring security and to take on the rebels. There's everyone's armed, and so it's a very insecure place, but it's also got this incredible potential for recovery because again, the habitat's largely untransformed. Pretty much everything is there, not rhinos of course, but everything that occurred there is still there, but just in depleted populations. But anyway, I had two from my perspective really interesting sightings there. One was a completely melanistic honey badger just during the day, and so I've never seen, I've seen camera trap photos of them. I've never seen a melanistic one. I have seen that species, of course, elsewhere, but and it was during a day just out for a morning bumble, and it was pretty fantastic. And then at night I was just spotlighting about 4 a.m. in the camp, and I heard some weird squealing, which I didn't recognize, but I was sure was a little carnivore, and I followed it, and it was an African palm civet kitten bleating to its mother. And I'd never seen African palm civet, and I know that's a widespread and easy species to find if you're in the right areas. It shows I haven't actually spent that much time in African forest, and mostly all my time's been in savanna. And this is sort of a mosaic of both. But it's just fantastic because at first I hadn't seen that little carnivore species, and I got great looks at this little fellow who was just complaining to mum, who I think had just come back from a foraging trip, and so the youngster was interested in what have you got, and was carrying on, and then so it was a really nice look. It was just a lovely sort of nice behavioral moment. And I went back to that. It was a big terminalia, and I thought, well, maybe this is where she stashes him. And so I went back on subsequent nights, and sure enough, I saw them both again for another 3 nights or so. So it was just, I really love those moments. And it's completely quiet, and there's no other activity, and you're just listening for what happens. And again, not a rare species, but an exciting one for me to see. It was lovely.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. And can I ask, did you ever clap eyes on an Asiatic cheetah in your 8 or 9 visits to the area?
No, yeah, the only one I saw was a cub that we rescued from a village that had been the story of this little cub. And when I say little, it was about 6 months old, 7 months old. It was not a tiny cub, but a local herder on a motorbike had seen this female cheetah with 3 cubs. He'd chased them and until one just fell over, and so you chase the cheetah on open ground and it will run for a kilometer or so, and then it just runs out of puff and exhausted, and he threw a Hessian sack over it and took it, thinking it was valuable and he was going to be able to sell it. Completely illegal, by the way. When the Iranian authorities find out about things like this, they have been savage. There are really severe fines and jail terms to killing or harassing cheetahs, so they've been quite serious about that over the years. But in any case, this fellow, a local businessman in a little remote town just sort of on the edge of a large national park with cheetahs in Iran, became aware of this, and he convinced this chap to give it up, and then he contacted the authorities. And so we just happened to be in the area, and the government called us and said, can you go and investigate and see what's going on? And so anyway, we retrieved this cub. We had to sort of bundle him up and put him in the back of our truck, and we took him back to Tehran. And in fact, he's still alive today. He's sort of part of a sort of planned breeding program that the Iranian authorities have proposed and planned. And in fact, he's too old now, I think, to sire cubs, but they have since brought 1 or 2 other. I think there's 2 females, also quite old, except one of them perhaps is reproductive, and they've caught a male, a wild male, and there is this idea to breed Asiatic cheetahs in captivity now.
So, Luke, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and telling us about your stories and some of the fascinating work that you have done in the past and you continue to do to this day. And really, I do have one final question for you, which is, when is your new book coming out?
Oh God, I wish you would know. Yeah, you.
Or is that a very rude question to ask?
It's supposed to be 2025, which I realize sounds like a long way away. I hope to make that, Charles, but I may not make that. But it's imminent. It's in yours in my lifetime. I can commit to
that. We await with bated breath, Luke.
Okay. I will say, by the way, just real quickly on that book, and it's been a pleasure to. But part of the book is I'm dealing with the whole cat family, extant and extinct. So it will include a sort of a not a massively comprehensive, but a summary section of all the described extinct species where we have sufficient fossil material to actually, to be convinced it's a discrete species. And there, Maurizio Anton, the paleo artist and scientist who just is unbelievable at reconstructing, particularly extinct cats, but extinct carnivores in general. And so he's illustrated all these species for the book. So he's done a number of fantastic books on extinct cats, including one particularly on the saber-tooths. But so he's drawn 50 odd of the extinct species, including a number of the saber-tooths, all the ones again that we can confidently describe. And so and they're just beautiful. So if nothing else, that part of the book will be worth it.
Wow, sounds wonderful. I'm just thinking, thank goodness time travel's not a thing, because if it was, mammal watching would just get exponentially more expensive.
Oh yeah, and that's where I would go. Yeah, when the saber cats were around, yeah, 2 or 3 big species on the African savanna, the huge bone-crushing hyena, with modern cats, with the 3 modern cats that coexisted. Can you imagine that as a safari?
Yeah, wow. Luke, thank you as well from me. I've got your books. It's lovely to see you in person, and just really fascinating hearing you talk so clearly and cogently about the work you're doing and the stuff that's going on. And good luck with your African golden cat. I feel sure there is one in your future.
Okay. Thanks, John. It's great. It's been great talking to you, and thanks, John, to you for the site. It's just become a great resource. It's really I'm often on there, mainly as a lurker, but it's such a fantastic resource these days. So thank you.
You've been listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.